Clarity is not born from comfort. It erupts when a human being finally admits how lost they have become. Our age overflows with choices, yet starves for direction, offering opportunity without depth, noise without grounding, and ambition without a center. We move fast, but we do not move inward. And so the oldest question returns with a new sharpness in the world of 2025. How do we live rightly? Why do the ancient philosophies of discipline, strategy, and self-mastery still cut deeper than the modern slogans promising ease? Because beneath every innovation, the human interior remains unchanged, fragile, impulsive, craving meaning, yet resisting responsibility. Long before our era, sages, warriors, and ascetics wrestled with this same storm within, and their struggle mirrors ours more than we dare to admit. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. But every philosophy begins with a confrontation. The moment we stop negotiating with illusion and face the real conditions of our existence. No strategy works if it is built on denial. No transformation begins until a person can name the terrain they stand on. This is why the first movement of any inner journey is acceptance, the harsh clarity of looking at life without distortion. And from this point, the path through the 10 chapters opens naturally, leading us deeper into energy, discipline, adaptability, resilience, and the quiet architecture of a meaningful life. Now we step toward the body of the work, beginning with the foundation, the demand to face reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. Reality is never what we want it to be. It is only what it is. And every form of wisdom begins at the moment we stop arguing with this truth. The modern world drowns us in choices, yet denies us clarity. It offers endless possibilities, yet withholds meaning. We wake each day surrounded by noise, stimulation, opportunity, yet inside we feel the same old confusion, the same restless hunger for direction. The paradox cuts deep. Humanity has never been more free, yet never more lost. That is why the question returns with brutal force. How do we live rightly when everything around us pulls us in conflicting directions? The ancient thinkers faced a different world, but the same inner struggle. Warriors, hermits, philosophers, ascetics, each confronted the limits of their illusions and found the same indispensable beginning, the courage to accept what is real. Before strategy comes vision. Before discipline comes clarity. Before transformation comes truth. And truth demands that we strip away every comforting story we tell ourselves about who we are and what the world owes us. The first task is not change. The first task is recognition. Jung reminded us that suffering intensifies when the psyche refuses to see the facts standing before it. Sartre showed that freedom becomes unbearable when we deny responsibility. The Stoics taught that emotional collapse begins when desire collides with the immovable. All these voices converge into one lesson. Acceptance is not resignation. Acceptance is alignment with reality so that action can finally begin. Most human suffering does not arise from the circumstance itself, but from the mind's resistance to it. We cling to the life we imagined rather than face the life we actually have. We resist endings we cannot prevent. We deny truths we already know. We argue against forces that will not bend. And in that argument, we destroy our own strength. Reality does not change out of pity. Reality does not negotiate with our expectations. Reality exists beyond our preference. But when we stop fighting it, something shifts. The tension dissolves. The mind stops burning. Space opens for deliberate action. That is why acceptance is not surrender. It is the removal of illusion so that effort is no longer wasted. In existential psychology, acceptance is not passive. It is an act of confrontation. To accept is to look directly at the condition of one's life without distortion. It is to acknowledge the limits of control while claiming the responsibility that remains. It is to say, this is what is true now, and I will not hide from it. This is the birthplace of maturity. Nothing grows in denial. Denial freezes the psyche. It traps energy. It suffocates possibility. But acceptance unlocks movement. It transforms pain into direction. It converts chaos into information. It turns the unbearable into something workable. The modern individual fears acceptance because they mistake it for defeat. They believe acceptance means giving up. They believe it means tolerating injustice, mediocrity, stagnation. But that is misunderstanding. Acceptance does not end action. Acceptance sharpens action. When we stop wasting our strength resisting what cannot be changed, we finally have strength left to change what can. The Stoics taught this centuries ago, but 2025 makes the lesson urgent. We live in an era addicted to avoidance, endless distraction, constant escape. The refusal to sit with discomfort has become a cultural epidemic. And without the ability to face discomfort, no transformation can occur. To accept reality is to reclaim agency. To deny reality is to live as a victim of fantasies that collapse under the weight of the real world. Acceptance is the moment the ego stops pretending and starts seeing. It is the moment illusions die so that a deeper clarity can be born. The individual who accepts what is true gains a power unavailable to those who cling to wishful thinking. They can act precisely because they are not blind. But acceptance requires a ruthless honesty many fear. It asks questions the ego tries to avoid. What in my life is not working? What have I been pretending not to know? What truths am I afraid to face? Where am I lying to myself? These questions cut. They expose the psyche. They strip away identity. They reveal the gap between who we are and who we claim to be. But without this exposure, the self cannot grow. Clarity is brutal, but the brutality liberates. Acceptance also demands the ability to see limits without interpreting them as failure. Every human life is shaped by constraints: time, energy, history, circumstance, biology, psychology. These limits do not diminish us. They define the field in which meaning can emerge. To accept limits is to understand the frame of one's existence. It is to stop expecting the impossible. It is to focus energy where it has force rather than scattering it into fantasies. When a person accepts their limits, they stop wasting their strength fighting battles they cannot win and begin choosing battles worthy of their life. Yet, acceptance is not only about recognizing limits, it is also about acknowledging potential. Seeing what is does not mean ignoring what could be. It means distinguishing between the two. The person who refuses to accept the present cannot build the future. Denial kills momentum. Acceptance creates direction. It draws a line in the psyche. Here is where I stand. From here, I begin. Without this baseline, every attempt at change collapses into confusion. In therapy, acceptance is the moment healing begins. Patients who cling to the belief that their suffering should not exist cannot move. Or when they say, "This is my pain now," "This is my condition," "This is my truth," the psyche reorganizes. The energy previously locked in resistance becomes available for transformation. Acceptance turns the mind toward what must be done instead of what cannot be undone. That shift, though subtle, is revolutionary. And yet, acceptance demands another layer of courage. It requires us to accept not only external reality, but internal reality. To accept our fears, our wounds, our flaws, our desires. To accept that we are not as strong as we pretend, not as consistent as we claim, not as controlled as we project. This humility softens the ego. It breaks the illusion that we can bypass our own humanity. And in that softness, something unexpected appears: compassion. Not weakness, but clarity without cruelty. Compassion allows us to work with ourselves rather than against ourselves. When a person accepts themselves as they are, the internal war ends. The critic grows quiet. The shadow loses its threat. The psyche stops fragmenting into competing selves. Acceptance integrates. It gathers. It steadies. It builds the foundation upon which discipline, strategy, and transformation can stand. Without acceptance, every improvement is superficial. With acceptance, improvement becomes inevitable. The philosophical traditions knew this long before psychology named it. The Stoic faced fate with calm recognition. The monk faced suffering with unflinching awareness. The warrior faced mortality without denial. The sage faced ignorance without shame. All began in the same place: reality. The modern world seduces us into believing we can escape this starting point, but escape only deepens suffering. We return always to the ancient truth. To change life, we must see life. To see life, we must accept life. Acceptance clears the fog. It reveals the map. It shows where we are and what terrain lies ahead. Without this orientation, no strategy can succeed. No effort can sustain. no growth can endure. Acceptance is the ground upon which every step will be built. And once the ground is solid, another question rises with quiet force. If acceptance reveals reality, what reveals the forces that move within us? What shapes our hunger, our ambition, our impulses, restlessness? What directs the energy that drives us forward or pulls us back? The next task is unavoidable. We must confront the nature of human energy, the structure of desire, and the limits that define our strength. Human energy is never neutral. It pushes, it pulls, it demands, it shapes every direction of a life long before thought begins its commentary. If acceptance is the foundation of clarity, then understanding the nature of human energy is the foundation of movement. Without this understanding, people drift, lost in impulses they mistake for decisions, governed by forces they believe originate in intention, but in truth emerge from deeper strata of the psyche. And because they do not see these forces, they misinterpret themselves. They call their compulsions choices, their cravings purpose, their exhaustion weakness. They judge themselves through the narrow lens of conscious desire, unaware that desire is the surface of an ocean far deeper than they can imagine. Schopenhauer insisted that the core of human existence is not thought, but will. Will as impulse. Will as blind movement. Will as the engine that drives us, whether we understand it or not. Freud later translated this into psychological language, arguing that desire, instinct, drive sit beneath every civilized behavior. Jung widened the lens further, showing that energy is not only biological, but symbolic, capable of transformation, capable of rising or collapsing, depending on how the psyche interacts with it. These thinkers disagreed on many things, but one truth connects them. Human beings are not rational creatures who occasionally feel. We are energetic creatures who occasionally rationalize. The first truth of human energy is that desire is natural, but not trustworthy. Desire emerges as instinctive movement towards something that promises relief or expansion. It flares quickly. It fades quickly. It is the fire that lights without warning. But desire is not direction. It is not purpose. It is not strategy. Desire is raw, unfiltered information about the current state of the psyche. It reveals longing. It reveals fear. It reveals deficiency. It reveals hunger. But without refinement, desire becomes enslavement. What we crave begins to own us. What we chase begins to shape what we become. This is why people suffer under the weight of their own impulses. They confuse intensity with meaning. They mistake craving for calling. They chase pleasure, believing it will free them, but pleasure is never satisfied. They chase achievement, believing it will complete them, but achievement only feeds further hunger. They chase validation, believing it will stabilize them, but validation never arrives in the form that truly soothes. Schopenhauer described this cycle as the torture of the will, the endless oscillation between desire and disappointment. Freud called it repetition. Jung called it one-sided energy. All pointed to the same structure. Human desire, left unexamined, becomes a loop from which the psyche cannot escape. The second truth is that energy seeks expression. If denied, it twists into distortion. If indulged without awareness, it becomes addiction. If redirected skillfully, it becomes power. The raw force of human longing can destroy, but it can also transform. It depends on whether the individual understands how to channel it. Freud saw the danger of repression clearly. What the conscious mind refuses to feel does not disappear. It returns as symptom, as obsession, as compulsion. Jung deepened this argument by showing that repression traps libido, the psychological energy that fuels creativity, curiosity, vitality. Repressed libido becomes stagnant. Stagnant libido becomes depression. Depression is not emptiness. It is energy that has lost its direction. Modern society intensifies this stagnation. In the age of 2025, people drown in options, yet lack inner structure. They pursue stimulation to escape the discomfort of suggestion, stillness. They exhaust themselves with activity to avoid their own unresolved desires. They chase short-term rewards because long-term vision feels too distant, too abstract, too demanding. The brain becomes conditioned to immediate gratification. The will becomes fragmented. The psyche becomes restless without orientation. Human energy, once capable of deep creation, now disperses into countless distractions. And the person wonders why they feel tired, even when they have done nothing meaningful. The third truth is that energy requires boundaries. Without boundaries, desire multiplies until the individual becomes enslaved by their own appetites. Schopenhauer called this the tragedy of the will. The more it is fed, the stronger it becomes. Freud observed that the ego must regulate instinct or be overwhelmed by it. Jung saw that the goal is not domination of instinct, but integration, allowing energy to flow within a structure that supports rather than destroys. Boundaries are not denial. They are containment. They give form to the formless. They prevent energy from spilling into compulsive behavior. They turn impulse into intention. Boundaries transform raw desire into durable motivation. Motivation is not born from inspiration. It is born from structure. To work consistently, the psyche needs alignment between instinct and discipline. Instinct provides force. Discipline provides direction. Together, they become momentum. Without discipline, instinct becomes chaos. Without instinct, discipline becomes dead routine. People burn out not because they work too hard, but because their work lacks meaningful alignment with the will. They force themselves to act without understanding the energy beneath the action. They grind through tasks with no connection to deeper purpose. The psyche rebels. Energy collapses. The fourth truth is that the highest use of energy is transformation. Jung insisted that libido is not fixed in form. Sexual energy can become creativity. Aggression can become courage. Fear can become insight. Desire can become aspiration. What matters is direction. When energy rises from primitive form to symbolic form, the psyche evolves. This is why individuals who learn to transmute their drives into disciplined action become powerful. They are no longer thrown back and forth by impulse. They direct the energy towards something worthy. But transformation requires awareness. The individual must understand the origin of their desires. They must ask what exactly they are seeking when they pursue stimulation, achievement, intimacy, escape. Most desires hide deeper desires. The longing for pleasure hides the longing for comfort. The longing for success hides the longing for significance. The longing for validation hides the longing for belonging. Every surface desire conceals a psychological truth. When the individual confronts these truths, energy becomes transparent. It becomes workable. It becomes a tool rather than a trap. The fifth truth is that human beings are easily dominated by short-term impulses because the psyche is designed to avoid discomfort. Discomfort signals risk. Risk signals danger. The body moves to protect itself. But in the modern world, discomfort rarely indicates threat. It indicates effort. And effort is the price of transformation. The psyche must learn to distinguish between instinctive avoidance of harm and instinctive avoidance of growth. The two feel identical, but one protects life while the other prevents life from expanding. This is where will enters as a counterforce. Will is not desire. Desire wants. Will decides. Desire pulls. Will directs. Desire fluctuates. Will remains. Will is the self-chosen orientation toward a chosen path, regardless of emotional weather. It is the force that says, I will move even when I do not feel like moving. But will cannot exist without acceptance of reality. Will must rise from clarity, not fantasy. Otherwise, it becomes self-punishment disguised as discipline. Once will and instinct begin to align, energy becomes stable. It becomes durable. It becomes capable of sustaining long-term vision. This stability is rare in the age of 2025 because people chase emotional spikes instead of cultivating energetic endurance. They want the thrill of beginning, not the discipline of continuing. They want motivation, not momentum. But momentum belongs only to those who understand their own energy well enough to steward it. To master energy is not to dominate it. It is to cooperate with it, to negotiate with the self, to understand the tides of desire and the cycles of motivation, to work when energy is high and to rest when energy sinks without shame, to know when the psyche demands intensity and when it demands silence. This cooperation makes life coherent. The individual stops fighting themselves. They begin to move in rhythm with their own nature. And yet, one more truth waits beneath all of this. Energy alone is not enough. Desire without direction becomes chaos. Will without vision becomes rigidity. Instinct without perspective becomes blindness. To live wisely, energy must be shaped by strategy. The psyche must learn not only how to move, but where to move. Acceptance gives reality. Energy gives force. Strategy gives orientation. And strategy begins with the ability to see beyond the impulse of the moment, to read the terrain of life the way a general reads the battlefield, to understand that timing, vision, and perspective determine the quality of every action that follows. Strategy is not a luxury of the disciplined. It is the necessity of anyone who refuses to live as a pawn of circumstance. Human energy without strategy becomes waste. Desire without orientation becomes self-sabotage. Will without perspective becomes rigidity that collapses under its own weight. To strategize is to confront the terrain of life the way a commander confronts the battlefield, with clarity, with cold judgment, with the refusal to confuse hope for reality. The individual who cannot strategize is condemned to repeat their past. The one who learns to strategize begins to shape their future. The first truth of strategy is that perspective comes before movement. People act impulsively because they fear stillness. Stillness exposes confusion. Stillness forces the psyche to confront its own lack of direction. But strategy begins in that silence. In the moment the individual steps back from instinct and examines the field from above. What forces shape my life? Where is my energy leaking? What patterns dominate my decisions? What obstacles repeat? These questions demand a high vantage point. Without that vantage point, every action becomes reactive rather than intentional. Sun Tzu understood that victory is won before the battle begins. Marcus Aurelius understood that the mind must see the whole rather than cling to one fragment. Nietzsche understood that the individual who knows their why can endure almost anyhow. Strategy unites these truths. It pulls the psyche out of narrow emotional focus and forces it into panoramic vision. This is why immature minds avoid strategy. They prefer the intoxication of impulse. Strategy demands maturity. It demands the ability to see beyond the current desire, to anticipate consequence, to recognize the invisible structure shaping events. The second truth of strategy is that internal terrain must be mapped before external terrain. People study markets, relationships, opportunities, enemies. They rarely study themselves. They approach life as though the biggest threat lies outside, when in reality, the greatest threat is always internal chaos. No plan survives contact with an unstable psyche. The mind that cannot regulate itself will sabotage every opportunity it touches. The emotions that remain unexamined will distort every decision. The fears that remain unnamed will quietly dictate every action. Strategy begins with self-mapping. Where am I strong? Where am I weak? Where do I collapse? Where do I lie to myself? Without this map, the individual misinterprets every obstacle because they cannot distinguish between external resistance and internal resistance. This is why so many fail, not because the world opposes them, but because they misunderstand the true source of their difficulty. They blame circumstance for what is actually fear. They blame lack of opportunity for what is actually lack of clarity. They blame others for what is actually their own unexamined patterns. A person who cannot read their internal map walks blind through every strategic field. Their choices become guesswork. Their failures become repetitions. Their victories are accidental and short-lived. The third truth of strategy is that timing determines the fate of every action. Even the right move fails at the wrong time. Even brilliant ideas collapse when executed in haste. Even genuine potential dies in premature exposure. People destroy their own progress because they cannot tolerate waiting. They act to relieve anxiety rather than to execute wisely. But everything in nature grows according to rhythm. Human lives are no different. There is a season for preparation, a season for execution, a season for withdrawal, a season for endurance. The strategist reads these inner seasons as clearly as the external ones. They do not force action during times of gathering. They do not retreat during times of expansion. They move with the rhythms of the psyche rather than against them. But modern culture pressures individuals to act constantly, to chase goals without pause, to produce without reflection, to prove themselves through relentless motion. In such an environment, strategy becomes rebellion. It is the refusal to move simply because others are moving. It is the refusal to run simply because others are running. Strategy demands stillness in a world terrified of silence. It demands patience in a world addicted to immediacy. It demands conviction in a world driven by reaction. To strategize in 2025 is to stand against the tidal pull of distraction and choose deliberate orientation instead. The fourth truth is that emotion, when misunderstood, corrupts strategy. People mistake emotional intensity for truth. They mistake excitement for opportunity. They mistake fear for danger. But emotions are signals, not commands. Strategy requires that emotions be examined, not obeyed blindly. Fear often indicates potential. Excitement often indicates fantasy. Anger often indicates boundary. Sadness often indicates transition. The strategist listens to emotion the way a seasoned navigator listens to weather. They respect its power, but do not surrender to it. They adjust. They recalibrate. They choose the direction that aligns with both internal truth and external reality. This emotional intelligence is rare because it demands vulnerability. One must be willing to feel deeply without allowing feeling to hijack decision. The immature psyche either suppresses emotion or is ruled by it. Strategy requires the third path, the integration of emotion into awareness without dissolving into it. To understand emotion is to understand the psyche's shifting winds. To misunderstand emotion is to crash into the same obstacles repeatedly. The fifth truth of strategy is that every meaningful path contains sacrifice. People want outcomes without cost, growth without discomfort, change without loss. With strategy clarifies cost and demands payment. Energy is finite. Time is finite. Attention is finite. To move toward one thing is to move away from another. A person who refuses sacrifice remains trapped in indecision. They seek paths that require nothing, yet deliver everything. These paths do not exist. Strategy demands choosing the discomfort worth suffering for. It demands embracing the losses that make space for transformation. Without this acceptance, a person may desire a new life endlessly, but never commit to the realities that create it. The sixth truth is that long-term vision must govern short-term action. Short-term thinking reacts. Long-term thinking shapes. Short-term thinking chases validation. Long-term thinking builds identity. Short-term thinking collapses under pressure. Long-term thinking endures. Most people live in short cycles because they seek relief from anxiety rather than alignment with purpose. They make decisions that soothe the present at the expense of the future. They choose distraction over discipline, impulse over intention. But strategy is the art of allegiance to the future self over the comfort of the present self. It is the refusal to betray tomorrow for the illusion of ease today. The seventh truth is that no strategy survives intact without adaptability. The world shifts, circumstances evolve, the psyche transforms. A rigid plan becomes a prison, a fluid plan becomes a compass. Adaptability is not weakness, it is proof of awareness. The strategist holds vision firmly and method lightly. They do not cling to a tactic simply because it once worked. They do not cling to an identity simply because it once fit. They move as the world moves, but they do not lose their axis. Adaptability guided by purpose becomes resilience. Adaptability guided by fear becomes chaos. Strategy distinguishes the two. The eighth truth of strategy is that clarity demands elimination. People try to improve their lives by adding more goals, more habits, more complexity. But strategy sharpens by subtraction. Remove what drains, remove what distracts, remove what contradicts, remove what confuses. Most lives collapse not from lack of ambition, but from excess ambition with no hierarchy. When everything matters, nothing matters. When the mind pursues 10 paths, it walks none. Elimination is not loss, it is refinement. It is the sculptor cutting away marble until the form emerges. As strategy deepens, the individual begins to sense something unsettling and liberating. Life becomes less chaotic, not because circumstances have changed, but because perception has. Decisions no longer feel overwhelming. Obstacles no longer feel fatal. Setbacks no longer feel personal. The psyche begins to see patterns, and once patterns are visible, the world becomes navigable. Strategy transforms the individual from a passenger of circumstance into a participant in their own evolution. Yet even this mastery reveals a further layer of truth. Strategy can guide movement, but it cannot determine meaning. It can map the terrain, but it cannot answer the question of why one should walk it. It can clarify action, but it cannot reveal purpose. Purpose is not constructed by strategy. Purpose is discovered through contact with the deeper layers of the self. And once strategy aligns with purpose, action becomes something more than efficient. It becomes inevitable, which means the next confrontation is unavoidable. If strategy requires direction, then direction requires vision. Not fantasy, not ambition. Vision, the psychological capacity to see beyond the present self and into the human being one is called to become. Vision is not imagination. Vision is the capacity to see a future self that does not yet exist and yet demands existence. It is the moment the psyche recognizes a direction that feels both frightening and undeniable. A person without vision drifts. A person with distorted vision collapses. But a person with true vision moves with a force that cannot be generated by motivation or discipline alone. Vision is not fantasy, because fantasy comforts. Vision disrupts. Fantasy indulges desire. Vision exposes responsibility. Fantasy creates escape. Vision creates demand. The first truth of vision is that it reveals who we must become, not who we wish to be. Wishful thinking is soft. It bends to convenience. It changes weakly. It dissolves under pressure. But vision is ruthless. It confronts the individual with a version of themselves that requires sacrifice, clarity, structure, and courage. Vision does not flatter the ego. It challenges it. It stretches it. It strips away every excuse the mind uses to avoid transformation. When people say they do not know what they want, they are not lacking vision. They are avoiding it. Because once vision appears, mediocrity becomes impossible. Vision emerges from the deepest part of the psyche, the part uncorrupted by fear and untouched by social conditioning. But the ego often suppresses it because vision requires loss of comfort, loss of identity, loss of illusions. Nietzsche understood this when he insisted that becoming requires destroying the person we have been. Jung saw it in the individuation process. The future self calls, and the present self must die. The call is rarely gentle. It shakes the psyche. It disrupts certainty. And the individual feels torn between the safety of the known and the haunting pull of what they could be. The second truth of vision is that it requires the individual to confront their own smallness. Vision exposes how much potential we have wasted. It shows us the gap between our current self and our possible self. It reveals how many of our choices were driven by fear rather than purpose. Most people cannot endure this exposure. They choose distraction over confrontation. They bury their vision beneath responsibilities, routines, and rationalizations. They call it practicality. But it is surrender disguised as maturity. True vision demands humility because it forces the ego to admit how limited it has been. Vision is a mirror that shows us both our strength and our cowardice. It shows us what we are capable of and therefore what we have refused. This is why vision feels like accusation before it becomes guidance. It confronts the psyche with its own betrayal. But humility alone is not enough. Vision also demands audacity. The audacity to imagine a life beyond the patterns that shaped us. The audacity to defy expectations of others. The audacity to believe that the inner call is not delusion, but direction. This audacity is rare in the age of 2025 because the world rewards conformity, not depth. The world teaches individuals to imitate, not to imagine. And yet the human spirit decays when vision is abandoned. The third truth of vision is that it must be shaped, not worshipped. Many people turn their vision into an idol. They romanticize it. They fantasize about it. They speak endlessly about it without giving anything to it. This is vision distorted into escapism. Vision must be anchored in reality. It must be translated into structure. It must be broken into actions that the psyche can metabolize. Without grounding, vision becomes torment, the image of a life we desire but never move toward. Grounding vision requires precision. What exactly does this future self demand of me? What skills must I build? What habits must I break? What patterns must I unlearn? What environments must I leave? What relationships must I release? These questions turn vision into direction. Without them, vision remains an unattainable projection. With them, vision becomes a blueprint for transformation. But even precision is insufficient without endurance. Vision collapses when the individual cannot tolerate slow progress. The psyche craves rapid transformation, dramatic shifts, immediate results. But vision unfolds in seasons. It requires repetition. It requires resilience. It requires the ability to endure boredom, failure, doubt, and stagnation without abandoning the path. This endurance is the crucible where vision becomes reality. The fourth truth of vision is that it must coexist with uncertainty. Vision does not guarantee clarity at every step. It provides orientation, not certainty. Too many abandon their vision when details become unclear. They panic when progress slows. They misinterpret ambiguity as error. But ambiguity is part of the process. The psyche must learn to move without full visibility, to trust direction more than detail, to act before conditions are perfect. If one waits for certainty, they wait forever. This tolerance for uncertainty is what separates the individual who grows from the one who never begins. It is the capacity to walk into the unknown with deliberate calm. Stoic philosophy understood this deeply. Control lies only in action, never in outcome. Jung understood it as the tension of opposites, holding both fear and conviction without collapsing into either. In this tension, vision matures. The fifth truth is that vision is dangerous. It threatens the existing identity. It disrupts relationships built on old versions of ourselves. It exposes the fragility of the life we constructed to avoid existential confrontation. When vision enters the psyche, everything built on avoidance begins to crumble. People fear this collapse. They cling to the familiar, even as the familiar suffocates them. But the collapse is necessary. A new self cannot emerge atop the ruins of the old without first clearing the debris. Vision is also dangerous because it triggers envy in others. People who have abandoned their own vision cannot tolerate the presence of someone who has not surrendered. They mock, they minimize, they warn, they project their fear onto the one who dares to evolve. The visionary must learn to withstand this psychological pressure. The path demands solitude, not because vision isolates, but because not everyone can walk alongside it. The sixth truth of vision is that it must be lived, not merely held. Vision is not internal decoration. It is internal direction. It is not something to admire. It is something to obey. It asks for integration into every domain of life. It reshapes relationships, work, priorities, habits, identity. If vision does not alter daily behavior, it is not vision. It is entertainment. And entertainment cannot transform a life. The seventh truth is that vision evolves. The image of the future self shifts as the psyche grows. Early visions are often immature projections, fantasies of success, recognition, power. But as the individual deepens, vision becomes less about achievement and more about alignment. It becomes less about ambition and more about authenticity. It becomes less about escape and more about responsibility. This evolution is inevitable. A rigid vision becomes a cage. A flexible vision becomes a guide. This evolution reflects the inner transformation of the psyche. As strategy deepens, energy stabilizes, and acceptance clarifies reality, vision becomes the bridge between what is and what could be. And as that bridge strengthens, the person begins to feel something new, momentum. Not motivational energy, but existential movement, a current that pulls them toward a greater coherence. Yet vision alone cannot complete the journey. Vision must become embodiment. Purpose must move from abstraction into action. Imagined identity must become lived identity. The psyche must shift from seeing the future self to becoming the future self. And for this becoming to take form, another force is needed. A force older than vision, deeper than strategy, more intimate than discipline. Identity itself must be confronted, broken, rebuilt, and aligned with the direction the vision demands. Identity is the quiet tyrant of human life. It shapes everything, yet remains mostly invisible. We cling to it as though it were truth, even when it is only habit. We defend it as though it were essence, even when it is only memory. Identity gives us coherence, but it also limits us. It gives us stability, but it also traps us. And when vision arrives demanding transformation, identity becomes the first and strongest barrier the psyche must dismantle. Because the self we want to become cannot coexist with the self we refuse to stop being. Identity begins as adaptation. A child learns which behaviors bring approval and which bring punishment. They learn what ends belonging and what threatens abandonment. They learn which emotions are tolerated and which must be buried. Slowly, through thousands of subtle interactions, the psyche constructs an identity that ensures survival. But survival is not truth. Survival is not freedom. Survival is only the beginning. The identity that protected the child suffocates the adult. Yet most people spend their entire lives loyally obeying a version of themselves built for a different environment, a different era, a different vulnerability. The first truth of identity is that it is a story, not a fact. The ego tells this story relentlessly. I am this kind of person. I cannot change. I must protect this version of myself. But the psyche is not fixed. It is fluid. It is dynamic. It is capable of becoming far more than the identity that organizes it. Jung understood this deeply. Identity is only the provisional mask the ego uses to navigate the world. The mask is necessary, but when the mask becomes fused to the face, the individual forgets that they ever had a choice. They confuse stability with authenticity, when authenticity requires evolution. The second truth is that identity resists change with enormous force. When vision challenges it, identity fights back. It attacks the individual with fear. You will fail. You will collapse. You will lose everything. It attacks with shame. Who do you think you are to desire more? It attacks with memory. Remember when you tried before and broke? This resistance is not proof that vision is wrong. It is proof that identity is threatened. And identity, like any structure built for survival, will do anything to preserve itself. This is why transformation feels like death. The psyche interprets identity change as existential risk. It believes that losing the old self means losing safety. But the truth is harsher. Clinging to the old self ensures stagnation. The only way to grow is to let the outdated identity collapse, to stop performing the version of yourself that others expect, to stop repeating the roles that once protected you, to stop choosing behaviors that belong to a smaller, frightened past. The third truth is that identity is reinforced by environment. People remain the same not because they lack will, but because their surroundings mirror their old self. Environments reward consistency. They punish evolution. Friends expect the old version of you. Family expects familiarity. Society expects predictability. When you begin to change, these external mirrors distort. People around you feel threatened because your growth exposes their stagnation. They pull you back, consciously or unconsciously, into the identity that keeps them comfortable. This is why personal evolution demands psychological distance, not cruelty, not rejection, distance, space to become without being dragged into the gravitational pull of previous selves. The fourth truth is that identity must be deconstructed before it can be reconstructed. People try to build a new self on top of the old one, but the foundation is unstable. They try to adopt new habits while clinging to old beliefs. They try to pursue new goals while maintaining old fears. They try to step into a larger life while protecting the small self they have outgrown. This contradiction destroys progress. Identity must be stripped down to its core assumptions. What do I believe about myself? Where did these beliefs come from? Who taught me to think this way? Do these beliefs belong to my adult self or to the frightened child I once was? Deconstruction is painful because it exposes illusions the ego depended on. Illusions of competency, illusions of superiority, illusions of limitation, illusions of powerlessness. When these illusions collapse, the psyche feels naked. But this nakedness is clarity. It is the ground upon which the new identity can be built. The fifth truth is that identity is not discovered, it is created. People obsess over finding themselves, as if the self were buried, somewhere waiting for excavation. But identity is not a fossil. It is a construction. It emerges from choices, actions, values, and commitments. The self is not something we uncover. It is something we build. Nietzsche understood this when he insisted that a human being becomes who they are only through deliberate creation. Jung echoed this idea when he wrote that individuation is the conscious shaping of one's own psychological life. Creation requires agency. It requires authorship. It requires choosing who you will be rather than inheriting identity from family, culture, trauma, or laziness. Most people wait for identity to reveal itself. They wait for clarity. They wait for certainty. But clarity emerges only from movement. Identity stabilizes only when the psyche repeatedly acts in alignment with the values of the self it chooses to become. The sixth truth is that identity must match vision. A person cannot hold a grand vision with a small identity. The psyche collapses from there. It is about psychological familiarity. We fear what does not match our current identity. We fear success because it demands responsibility. We fear visibility because it threatens old shame. We fear intimacy because it threatens old wounds. We fear our own potential because it threatens our laziness. Fear reveals the boundary of identity, and the only way to transcend that boundary is to act while afraid, not recklessly, not impulsively, deliberately. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is movement in the presence of fear. And with each courageous action, fear loses authority. The eighth truth is that identity must align with values, not emotions. Emotions fluctuate, values endure. If identity is built on emotion, it crumbles during chaos. If identity is built on value, it survives storms. Values act as the internal compass. They determine the direction the psyche moves, even when motivation is absent. But most people have never articulated their values. They inherit them. They absorb them. They imitate them. True values must be chosen. They must be lived. They must be defended. Identity without values is a costume. Identity with values is a foundation. The ninth truth is that identity shapes destiny. The world does not respond to what we want. It responds to who we are. An individual with a powerless identity attracts powerless outcomes. An individual with a fragmented identity makes fragmented decisions. An individual with a coherent identity walks with a force that others instinctively recognize. They move differently. They speak differently. They choose differently. The world bends toward their presence. This is not mystical. It is psychological gravity. Identity shapes perception. Perception shapes action. Action shapes outcome. When identity shifts, the entire trajectory of a life shifts. The person no longer chases alignment, they become aligned. They no longer seek approval, they embody authority. They no longer need permission, they carry direction within themselves. Yet identity reconstruction is not the final task. It prepares the psyche for something even more demanding. Because once identity is rebuilt, the individual must face the way they move through time itself. Not the time measured by clocks, but the psychological time that determines momentum, endurance, pace, and the rhythm through which life unfolds. And until a person masters that rhythm, identity cannot fully anchor and vision cannot fully materialize. Time is not a neutral landscape. It is a current that drags, accelerates, resists, and tests the human spirit. And the greatest illusion of modern life is the belief that time moves uniformly for all people. It does not. Time bends around identity. Time expands for the disciplined and collapses for the drifting. Time intensifies for the self-aware and dissolves for the self-deceived. Most people do not suffer from lack of time. They suffer from lack of rhythm. They do not know how to enter the psychological tempo in which effort compounds, direction stabilizes, and life coheres. The first truth of time is that it is psychological before it is chronological. The clock moves in equal intervals, but the mind does not. A single hour of aligned action expands into significance. A full day of scattered action collapses into nothingness. This is why some people grow faster in a month than others grow in 5 years. Their inner rhythm matches the demands of their vision. Their energy, identity, and intention move in synchronized cadence. They are not faster, they are aligned. Others drown in the same hours because their inner world fights itself. Identity resists the task. Emotion resists discipline. Fear resists action. Desire pulls in contradictory directions. The psyche moves like a broken engine, firing against itself. They mistake exhaustion for productivity. They mistake busyness for momentum. They mistake collapse for rest. But the truth stands unyielding. Time rewards coherence and punishes fragmentation. The second truth of time is that pace determines outcome. Too slow, and life stagnates. Too fast, and the psyche fractures. Every transformation requires a specific pace. The problem is that most individuals do not listen to their internal tempo. They borrow the pace of others. They imitate the pace of culture. They accelerate out of insecurity and slow down out of fear. In 2025, the world pushes for acceleration at all costs. Hustle culture glorifies burnout. Productivity worship glorifies depletion. People force themselves into frantic speed without depth, and then wonder why their lives feel hollow, brittle, unstable. Strategy demands that a person find their true pace, the one that sustains both energy and identity. Nietzsche recognized this when he wrote that all great creation comes from long obedience, not erratic bursts. Jung recognized it as individuation unfolding in seasons, not explosions. The Stoics recognized it as deliberate movement, not frantic motion. Pace is wisdom expressed through time. The third truth is that momentum is the rarest psychological force. Momentum is not motivation. Motivation is emotional weather, shifting with mood, hunger, sleep, disappointment. Motivation belongs to the childlike psyche that expects to feel good before acting. But momentum belongs to the adult psyche that acts before feeling good. Momentum is built through repetition, the steady accumulation of small actions that synchronize the psyche into a unified rhythm. Once momentum begins, effort decreases and progress accelerates. The individual begins to move as though carried by a current they themselves created. Momentum collapses not from failure, but from interruption. Distraction is the antagonist of rhythm. One moment of escape fractures the psyche's cadence. One indulgence in avoidance breaks the chain. People underestimate the fragility of momentum because they do not understand its nature. Momentum is psychological inertia, and inertia obeys the laws of motion. Once disrupted, it demands greater energy to restart than it originally required to maintain. This is why discipline is not cruelty, it is protection. Discipline safeguards the fragile rhythm of becoming. It shields momentum from erosion. It preserves the coherence of the psyche long enough for identity to stabilize. But discipline must match the individual's true pace. Excess discipline crushes. Insufficient discipline dissolves. Identity, energy, and rhythm must negotiate continually until they establish a cadence that both stretches and sustains the self. The fourth truth of time is that seasons exist within the psyche. There are seasons of intensity when action must be ruthless. There are seasons of withdrawal when reflection must deepen. There are seasons of rest when the psyche rebuilds. There are seasons of confrontation when truths must be faced. People suffer when they misinterpret the season they are in. They force intensity during a season of reflection. They demand results during a season of healing. They retreat during a season that requires courage. They confuse internal winter for failure and internal summer for worth. The wise do not judge seasons, they obey them. The modern world ignores psychological seasons. It demands constant output, constant availability, constant acceleration. But the psyche does not grow under constant light. It grows through cycles. Jung understood that depth psychology mirrors nature: creation, destruction, renewal, dormancy. Healing happens in spirals, not in straight lines. Purpose unfolds in layers, not in leaps. When a person resists their season, time becomes an enemy. When a person aligns with their season, time becomes an ally. The fifth truth is that urgency is a double-edged force. Urgency awakens dormant energy. It pushes the psyche into clarity. It demands action. But false urgency burns the psyche into exhaustion. The anxiety-driven urge to hurry destroys precision and sabotages momentum. Many people live in chronic urgency not because life demands it, but because their fear does. Everything feels late. Everything feels collapsing. Everything feels catastrophic. This psychological urgency drains the will. The strategist must distinguish true urgency from fear urgency. True urgency arises when opportunity narrows or danger expands. Fear urgency arises when the individual cannot sit with uncertainty. The sixth truth is that time amplifies whatever identity holds. A fragmented identity becomes more fragmented. A coherent identity becomes more coherent. A disciplined identity compounds efforts. A chaotic identity compounds regrets. Time does not heal. Time magnifies. Healing occurs only when awareness, action, and responsibility converge. Without them, time simply deepens the grooves of the psyche's old patterns. This is why waiting does not transform a person. Waiting merely prolongs their current trajectory. Growth requires intentional efforts across time. The person must use time as a tool, not as a hiding place. Time reveals who is serious and who is pretending. Those who use time deliberately expand. Those who use time passively decay. The seventh truth of time is that patience is not passivity. Patience is endurance under intention. It is the capacity to continue acting without immediate reward. It is the strength to hold direction when progress is slow. Patience does not mean waiting quietly. It means persisting consistently. It is the psychological muscle that separates ambition from achievement. Most individuals fail not because their vision was impossible, but because their impatience shattered their rhythm. They wanted harvest without planting. They wanted results without repetition. They wanted mastery without apprenticeship. But patience must be paired with aggression. The psyche must move decisively when the moment demands it. This dynamic balance is the essence of psychological tempo. Too much patience becomes stagnation. Too much aggression becomes chaos. The individual must learn to sense the moment when waiting becomes avoidance or when action becomes impulsivity. The eighth truth is that the body itself is a clock. Fatigue signals imbalance. Restlessness signals misalignment. Sharpness signals readiness. Numbness signals repression. The body carries its own wisdom about timing, but most people ignore it. They override exhaustion with stimulants. They drown restlessness in distraction. They suppress instinct until it becomes anxiety. Listening to the body is not spiritual nonsense. It is psychological intelligence. The body reveals the pace that the psyche can sustain without collapse. When identity, strategy, energy, and body align, the individual enters a state of temporal coherence. Time feels different. Hours expand. Distractions lose their power. Work deepens. Insight sharpens. Progress accelerates. This state is rare because it requires the entire psyche to move as a unified force. But once accessed, it becomes the engine of transformation. The ninth truth is that time tests conviction. Vision feels inspiring in silence. Strategy feels clear in theory. Identity feels powerful in imagination. But time demands proof. Time asks whether the individual will act consistently, whether they will endure setbacks, whether they will persist through boredom, whether they will remain committed when the reward is distant. Conviction is not measured in intensity, but in duration. Anyone can burn brightly for a moment. Few can burn steadily for years. Time reveals whether the psyche is aligned or divided. When divided, the mind hesitates. The will fractures. The body resists. When aligned, movement becomes natural, even when difficult. The individual stops negotiating with themselves. They simply move. And in that movement, they discover the truth that people spend their lives avoiding. Mastery is not an act, but a rhythm. Yet, one final truth about time remains. Even when a person masters their pace, their momentum, their seasons, their patience, and their conviction, time alone cannot create a meaningful life. Time must be filled with direction, and direction demands choosing the path that justifies the cost of existence, the path that connects identity, vision, action, and sacrifice into something coherent. Without this final orientation, no mastery of time can save a life from drifting, which is why the next confrontation becomes unavoidable, the confrontation with purpose itself, the question that burns beneath every achievement and every failure, the question that refuses silence once the psyche has gained rhythm. Purpose is the question that dismantles every illusion we have about ourselves. It strips away comfort. It exposes drift. It confronts the silent despair that accumulates when a life moves without inner direction. Purpose does not ask what we want. It asks why we are alive. It demands an answer the ego cannot fabricate. It demands truth. And truth is costly. A life without purpose is easier. It asks for nothing. It tolerates anything. It drifts, numbed by routine, cushioned by distraction. But a life with purpose becomes heavier. Every action begins to matter. Every choice becomes a declaration. Every day becomes a test. People say they want purpose, but what they want is meaning without burden, depth without demand, purpose without the cost of becoming the person who can carry it. The first truth of purpose is that it is not found, it is confronted. People imagine purpose as a treasure buried deep within the psyche, waiting for discovery. But purpose is not a passive secret. It is an active demand. It reveals itself only when the individual becomes willing to surrender the versions of themselves that cannot bear responsibility. Every human being carries a sense of inner direction, but it is muffled by fear, drowned by noise, numbed by habit. Purpose does not hide. We hide from it. Because once we admit what matters, can no longer justify a life aligned with what does not. The second truth is that purpose is inseparable from burden. A purpose that costs nothing is nothing. It must pull the psyche forward and weigh on it simultaneously. It must disturb complacency while generating clarity. Nietzsche knew this when he wrote that a person who has a why can endure almost any how. The modern world reverses this. People search desperately for a how, comfortable enough that they will not need a why. But comfort is not meaning. Comfort is anesthesia. A person can be comfortable for decades and still starve for purpose. The hunger arrives quietly at first, then violently. It appears in restlessness, in exhaustion, in the feeling that life is slipping through one's hands without ever being truly lived. Purpose is not pleasure, it is direction. Pleasure collapses under suffering. Purpose deepens under suffering. Pleasure disappears under chaos. Purpose sharpens under chaos. Pleasure evaporates when life becomes difficult. Purpose reveals itself when life becomes unbearable. This distinction is why so many lose themselves in the age of 2025. They chase stimulation, thinking it will satisfy them. But stimulation cannot answer existential hunger. Only purpose can. The third truth is that purpose is born from confrontation with limitations. It does not arise from fantasies about who we want to be. It arises from recognition of what our life actually demands from us. A person's deepest purpose is often found in the heaviest truths they carry, the wound they cannot ignore, the injustice they cannot tolerate, the longing they cannot silence, the talent they cannot deny. Purpose does not emerge in neutrality. It emerges where the psyche feels most alive or most threatened. That is why purpose feels dangerous, because it reveals where the self must grow or where it must break. Purpose does not ask us to chase abstract ideals. It asks us to step into the arena where our deepest truths collide with our deepest fears. And that collision generates the heat of transformation. When people avoid this collision, they remain half formed. Their lives become a compromise between truth and fear. They maintain identities that prevent collapse, but also prevent fulfillment. Purpose demands that we choose collapse if collapse leads to rebirth. The fourth truth of purpose is that it is incompatible with fragmentation. A divided psyche cannot sustain purpose because purpose requires total alignment. Energy, identity, vision, will, discipline, all must converge. When one part of the psyche rebels, purpose fractures. When fear dominates, purpose fades. When desire overrides clarity, purpose corrupts. This is why so many cannot hold purpose. They try to carry it with the same identity that produced their aimlessness. They try to live with conviction while refusing to abandon the habits that dissolve conviction. Purpose is not a feeling, it is a structure, and the self must be rebuilt to hold it. The fifth truth is that purpose is not chosen freely, it chooses. And it chooses according to the architecture of the psyche. Jung understood this as vocation, the calling that emerges from the depths rather than from ambition. Purpose aligns with our unique configuration of strength, wound, value, instinct, and imagination. That is why imitation kills purpose. A borrowed purpose collapses. A forced purpose suffocates. Only the purpose that emerges from the individual's inner necessity endures. This inner necessity is not mystical, it is psychological. It is the point where our capacities meet our responsibility. Responsibility reveals purpose, not moralistic responsibility, but existential responsibility. The recognition that certain contributions are demanded from us specifically. No one else carries our combination of insight, wound, resilience, and orientation. To refuse purpose is to refuse ourselves. The sixth truth is that purpose is sustained through sacrifice. Without sacrifice, purpose remains theory. A person must give something up to create space for direction. The sacrifice might be comfort, reputation, relationships, self-image, or the routines that maintain stagnation. Sacrifice is not cruelty, it is purification. It removes what cannot belong to the life that purpose requires. People fear sacrifice because they fear emptiness, but purpose fills the void left behind. The seventh truth is that purpose must be embodied through action. Introspection alone cannot bring it to life. The psyche must move. It must test itself against reality. Purpose matures in the world, not in imagination. Action reveals where purpose is true and where it is fantasy. People who refuse action remain trapped in the illusion that they are discovering themselves, while they are actually avoiding themselves. Action exposes whether the purpose they claim matches the capacities they possess. Action refines purpose through failure, friction, and adaptation. A purpose untouched by friction is not yet purpose. The eighth truth is that purpose evolves as the psyche evolves. The purpose of a wounded self cannot be the purpose of a healed self. The purpose of an unconscious self cannot be the purpose of an integrated self. A growing individual must allow purpose to grow with them. Rigidity kills purpose by reducing it to a static idea. Flexibility allows purpose to shift into its truer form. But flexibility is not abandonment. It is listening. It is the willingness to adapt direction while protecting the inner core that gives direction meaning. Purpose evolves through cycles. First, it disturbs. Then it clarifies. Then it demands. Then it restructures. Then it expands. Many people quit during the disturbing phase because they want clarity without tension. Others quit during the demanding phase because they want progress without pressure. Purpose asks for endurance through all phases. Only then does it reveal its full power. The ninth truth is that purpose connects the individual to something larger than themselves. Not a collective in the shallow sense, but a deeper continuity of meaning. Work becomes contribution. Suffering becomes refinement. Discipline becomes expression. Sacrifice becomes alignment. Time becomes meaningful rather than mechanical. People who live with purpose do not escape hardship. They transcend it. Hardship becomes part of the architecture of their becoming. Without connection to something larger, the psyche collapses inward under its own weight. Purpose does not eliminate fear. It outclasses it. When purpose strengthens, fear loses authority. The individual no longer needs constant motivation because movement arises from internal alignment. They no longer feel lost because direction has become internal. They no longer feel fragile because fragility is replaced with coherence. Purpose does not make life easier. It makes life worth the difficulty. But once purpose stabilizes, another truth begins to surface. Purpose alone cannot create fullness. A person can live with purpose and still feel internally limited. Because purpose addresses the direction of life, but not the depth of experience. Direction without depth becomes machinery. Depth without direction becomes chaos. For a human being to fully awaken, purpose must merge with something more profound. The experience of meaning that arises not only from what we pursue, but from how we exist. And the next task emerges with unmistakable force to confront the inner architecture of meaning itself. The layer beneath purpose, where the psyche encounters the deepest questions of its existence. Meaning is not given, meaning is made. And yet, the modern psyche waits for it as though it were a gift life might someday deliver if we suffer politely enough. But meaning is not polite. Meaning is a force. It confronts us. It questions us. It demands that we participate in our own existence rather than drift through it. Purpose gives direction, but meaning gives depth. Without direction, we wander. Without depth, we starve. A life with purpose but without meaning becomes mechanical. A life with meaning but without purpose becomes chaotic. Meaning and purpose must merge before the psyche can feel whole. The first truth of meaning is that it emerges only when we stop avoiding the weight of existence. Human beings search for meaning not because life is empty, but because life is overwhelming. The world of 2025 floods us with information, expectation, and pressure. Under this constant assault, the psyche collapses into survival mode, mistaking numbness for peace and distraction for relief. But meaning does not reveal itself to the numbed. It reveals itself to the awake. It rises from the struggle to confront what we fear, to speak what we avoid, to carry what we once believed would break us. Meaning is found precisely where we resist looking, in the difficult choices, in the unresolved wounds, in the relationships that demand authenticity, in the responsibilities we once tried to escape. Meaning is born at the point where we begin telling ourselves the truth. Without this truth, every attempt to find meaning collapses into performance. The second truth is that meaning grows in proportion to responsibility. People claim they want meaning, but meaning requires carrying something heavier than comfort. The Stoics understood this. Nietzsche understood this. Jung understood this. A life gains meaning the moment we take responsibility for shaping it. Not blame, responsibility. Blame is passive. Responsibility is active. It transforms the psyche from victim into participant. It shifts the narrative from, why is this happening to me, into, what must I do now? Meaning is the psychological weight we choose to carry so that existence does not feel accidental. Responsibility does not suffocate us. It strengthens us. The individual who carries nothing becomes fragile. The individual who carries something becomes grounded. But the world trains us to avoid weight, to seek ease, to outsource responsibility, to blame systems, circumstances, or fates for the shape of our lives. Meaning emerges only when we reclaim that weight and lift it consciously. The third truth of meaning is that suffering is essential. Not because suffering is noble, but because suffering reveals what matters. When life is comfortable, everything feels important. When life becomes difficult, only the essential remains. Suffering strips us of illusions. It reduces life to its truth. It exposes our values. It clarifies our desires. It forces us to decide who we are when nothing is guaranteed. Viktor Frankl understood this in the most brutal conditions imaginable. He saw that meaning is not the absence of suffering, but the transformation of suffering into significance. Suffering without meaning crushes the psyche. Suffering with meaning forges it. People avoid suffering because they believe it threatens their identity. But suffering clarifies identity. It exposes the parts of us that were never real. It burns away the false stories. What remains is the foundation upon which meaning can be built. The fourth truth is that meaning emerges through contribution, not through grand gestures, through deliberate presence, through offering our strengths to a world that needs them, through giving form to something that did not exist before we acted. Contribution does not require recognition. It requires sincerity. A meaningful life is not defined by applause, but by alignment. The individual feels meaning when their actions resonate with their deepest values. This resonance creates coherence. Coherence creates dignity. Dignity creates inner strength. The modern world confuses contribution with productivity. Productivity measures output. Contribution measures impact. Productivity exhausts. Contribution nourishes. When people feel empty despite working constantly, it is because their work lacks meaning. They produce, but they do not contribute. They move, but they do not matter. Meaning demands more than activity. It demands intention. The fifth truth of meaning is that it requires intimacy with the world. Not romantic intimacy, but existential intimacy. The courage to feel deeply, to connect honestly, to relate without pretending. Meaning grows where there is depth of contact with art, with people, with nature, with suffering, with truth. But depth terrifies those who fear being seen, and so they avoid intimacy with themselves and with life. They coast on the surface, then wonder why everything feels shallow. To live meaningfully is to allow life to touch us, to allow ourselves to touch life. This intimacy is not always pleasant. It is often painful, but it makes life vivid. It turns existence from endurance into engagement. The sixth truth is that meaning is unstable until the psyche is integrated. Fragmentation creates contradiction. One part of the psyche seeks growth. Another part seeks comfort. One part desires truth. Another part hides from it. Meaning cannot survive internal warfare. It must be carried by a coherent self. This is why meaning collapses for people who refuse to confront their shadow, their wounds, or their contradictions. Meaning requires unity, not perfection, unity. A unified psyche can withstand pressure. A divided psyche cannot. As the psyche integrates, meaning becomes less fragile. It stops fluctuating with emotional weather. It becomes rooted in truth rather than feeling. And from this root, the individual begins to experience a strange, quiet force, the sense that life is not random, the sense that even suffering fits into a larger pattern. The seventh truth is that meaning must be practiced. It is not a revelation. It is a discipline. Meaning grows every time we act in alignment with our values, every time we choose responsibility over avoidance, every time we speak truth instead of performing, every time we face discomfort instead of escaping. Meaning expands with each act of integrity. It shrinks, with each act of self-betrayal. Meaning demands daily maintenance. Without it, entropy returns. The psyche drifts back into numbness. Avoidance re-enters. Doubt grows. The individual must continually anchor themselves in what matters, or they will be torn apart by what does not. But the deepest truth of meaning is this: meaning is not the final destination. It is the threshold. Once purpose clarifies direction and meaning deepens experience, the individual begins to sense something beyond both, something that demands not only alignment but expansion, something that cannot be reached with intellect alone, something that requires transcendence of the self that has been built so far. Meaning stabilizes the psyche, but what comes next transforms it. And when that transformation begins, the individual must confront not only what life expects from them, but what existence itself demands them to become. Transcendence begins where meaning reaches its limit, not because meaning fails, but because meaning exposes the boundary of the self that has carried it. Once the psyche stabilizes, once purpose aligns with direction and identity aligns with action, a deeper hunger emerges, the hunger to grow beyond the architecture of the self entirely. This desire is not ambition. It is not ego expansion. It is the recognition that the self, as constructed, is too small for the life that now demands to be lived. And this recognition becomes the ignition of transcendence. The first truth of transcendence is that it requires outgrowing the very structure that once saved us. Identity, purpose, meaning, all of these serve as scaffolding. They stabilize the psyche. They prevent collapse. They give coherence. But scaffolding is not the building. At some point, it must be dismantled for the structure to stand freely. Most people never reach this point because they mistake stability for fulfillment. They believe the end of chaos is the end of growth. But the end of chaos is only the beginning of expansion. Transcendence demands that we question even the truths that once empowered us. This questioning is not rebellion, it is evolution. The psyche senses a horizon beyond its current shape. It begins to feel the tension between who we are and who we could be if we allowed ourselves to exceed our own narrative. This tension grows quietly at first, a subtle dissatisfaction, a soft whisper that there is more. Then it grows louder. Meaning begins to feel insufficient, even restrictive. Purpose begins to feel heavy, even rigid. The identity that once felt powerful begins to feel confining. The psyche presses against the edges of its own design. That pressure signals the call to transcend. The second truth of transcendence is that it requires dismantling the ego's supremacy. The ego believes it is the center of the psyche. It believes it is the author of meaning, the driver of desire, guardian of survival. But transcendence reveals the ego as a limited instrument, essential but not ultimate. To transcend, one must stop living from the ego and begin living through the self, the deeper, more expansive intelligence that does not cling to identity, that does not fear change, that does not confuse routine with stability. This shift is terrifying because the ego interprets it as annihilation. Transcendence feels like death because the ego cannot distinguish evolution from erasure. But transcendence is not the destruction of the ego, it is the repositioning of it. The ego becomes a servant, not a ruler, a tool, not a tyrant, a function, not an identity. And when the ego steps down, space opens for the deeper self to take form. The third truth of transcendence is that it requires surrender to forces larger than personal preference, not supernatural forces, psychological ones. The unconscious begins to press upward with new intensity. Instinct refines, intuition sharpens, insight strikes with unnerving clarity. The individual begins to sense patterns in life that feel orchestrated, not accidental. This is not mysticism. It is the psyche integrating at a level far beyond the conscious mind's control. As Jung wrote, the self becomes the organizing principle, and one's life begins to align around this deeper axis. This alignment is not peaceful at first. It destabilizes the structures the ego relied upon. Old goals lose relevance. Old relationships feel misaligned. Old desires fade. The psyche is reorganizing itself around a deeper coherence, and anything that does not match this coherence begins to fall away. People interpret this as loss, but it is clearing. The psyche is shedding what cannot accompany the next phase. The fourth truth of transcendence is expansion of consciousness. Not expansion in the abstract sense, but the lived experience of seeing further, feeling deeper, understanding with greater precision. Patterns become visible, motives become transparent, the self gains altitude. This is why transcendence produces both liberation and discomfort. Liberation because the individual is no longer imprisoned by their old narrative. Discomfort because they can no longer hide from truths the ego once buried. This expanded awareness reshapes action. It becomes impossible to engage in behaviors that contradict the deeper self. Self-betrayal becomes intolerable. Distraction becomes hollow. Avoidance becomes painful. The psyche demands integrity at a level that once felt impossible. This is not morality, it is psychological law. The deeper the self awakens, the more violent the internal consequences of living against it. The fifth truth of transcendence is integration with paradox. The transcendent mind learns to hold opposites without collapse: joy and sorrow, strength and fragility, control and surrender, identity and impermanence. The ego seeks simplicity. The transcendent psyche seeks totality. It does not choose one truth over another. It holds all truths simultaneously. This capacity expands emotional range, cognitive depth, and existential resilience. The individual becomes unshakable, not because nothing can wound them, but because they no longer fear the wound. The sixth truth is that transcendence requires a new relationship with suffering. Suffering no longer appears as punishment or misfortune. It becomes information. It becomes signal. It becomes refinement. The transcendent psyche does not romanticize suffering. It understands suffering as part of the architecture of consciousness, a necessary fire that burns away illusion, a necessary pressure that strengthens the core, a necessary disruption that reveals hidden truths. Suffering becomes meaningful, not because it is desired, but because it is metabolized. The seventh truth is that transcendence demands solitude. Not physical solitude, but psychological solitude. The willingness to stand apart from the expectations, assumptions, and fears of others. The transcendent individual cannot rely on external validation to sustain their path. They walk according to an inner rhythm others cannot hear. This solitude is not loneliness, it is clarity. It is the stripping away of the noise that prevents alignment with the deeper self. Yet transcendence does not isolate, it deepens connection. The individual begins to see others not through the lens of ego, but through the lens of essence. Relationships become more honest, more intimate, more courageous. Superficial bonds dissolve, authentic bonds strengthen. The transcendent psyche loves more fiercely because it no longer loves from need, but from presence. The eighth truth is that transcendence leads naturally to contribution at a higher level. Not contribution driven by duty or approval, but contribution driven by overflow. The transcendent person becomes a source. Their presence influences. Their clarity guides. Their integrity stabilizes. Their words and actions carry weight because they are anchored in alignment rather than performance. Contribution becomes the external expression of internal expansion. But transcendence does not end in contribution. It prepares the psyche for its final confrontation. The realization that expansion alone is not completion. Beyond transcendence lies integration with something even more difficult. The acceptance that the self, no matter how expanded, remains impermanent. The next step demands a deeper kind of courage, the courage to let go, even of transcendence itself. Completion is not the end of becoming. It is the moment the self finally stops fighting itself. After transcendence shatters the limits of the old identity, something quieter begins to rise, a sense of inner coherence that does not depend on achievement, purpose, meaning, or momentum. Completion is not perfection. It is integration. It is the recognition that the self is no longer fragmented across fear, desire, avoidance, and memory. Completion feels less like triumph and more like returning to a center we had abandoned long before we knew we were searching. The first truth of completion is that it is not arrival. It is alignment. People imagine completion as the conclusion of growth, the moment the psyche becomes polished, healed, resolved. But completion has nothing to do with resolution. It has everything to do with acceptance. Completion is the moment we stop demanding that life validate us. It is the moment we stop negotiating with our past. It is the moment the psyche finally integrates all that it once rejected: the wound, the shadow, the desire, the weakness, the strength. The divided self becomes a whole self, not by eliminating conflict, but by holding it without collapse. The second truth is that completion requires the death of striving. Not striving in action, but striving in identity. For so long we fight to become someone else, someone stronger, someone clearer, someone more controlled. someone more aligned. But striving contains an accusation that who we are now is insufficient. Completion ends this accusation. It is not complacency. It is not surrender. It is the recognition that transformation cannot grow from self-rejection. True growth emerges only when the psyche stops waging war against its own nature. This is why completion feels paradoxical. The individual feels still, yet not stagnant. They feel capable, yet not pressured. They feel open to change, yet not fractured by it. The ego loosens. The deeper self leads. What once felt like struggle becomes flow. What once felt like resistance becomes guidance. The architecture of the psyche reorganizes itself around harmony rather than conflict. The third truth is that completion requires integration of the unconscious. The unconscious no longer erupts as chaos. It communicates. It collaborates. Dreams shift in tone. Reactions soften. Patterns dissolve. The psyche no longer hides parts of itself in fear of survival. Jung understood this moment as the emergence of the self, the totality of the psyche, expressing itself without censorship. The individual becomes internally unified. This unity generates an authority that is unmistakable. It is not the authority of dominance. It is the authority of coherence. The fourth truth is that completion transforms our relationship with the world. External pressures lose their ability to distort the inner compass. Approval becomes irrelevant. Comparison dissolves. Envy evaporates. The psyche no longer seeks direction from outside itself. It has its own axis now. The individual acts not to impress, not to prove, not to escape, but to express. This expression is calm. It is deliberate. It is unmistakably authentic. It carries a weight that others feel even when no words are spoken. With completion comes a reversal of fear. The individual no longer fears failure because failure no longer threatens identity. They no longer fear abandonment because belonging no longer determines worth. They no longer fear uncertainty because uncertainty no longer threatens the core. They walk into life with the quiet strength of someone who has already survived themselves. The fifth truth is that completion reveals what is essential. Once the ego's noise fades, priorities reorganize. Time becomes clearer. Energy becomes precise. Relationships filter themselves. The individual naturally gravitates toward what sustains them and disengages from what dilutes them. This is not detachment. It is refinement. Completion simplifies. It cuts the unnecessary. It distills life down to what genuinely matters. The sixth truth is that completion generates inner stability. Not the stability of rigidity, but the stability of groundedness. Life continues to bring uncertainty, pressure, suffering, and change. But the psyche no longer interprets these as personal threats. Stability arises from within, not from conditions. This inner stability is what allows the individual to move through life without shattering under its weight. They respond rather than react. They choose rather than collapse. They direct rather than drift. The seventh truth is that completion returns us to presence, not as a technique, not as a spiritual goal, but as a natural result of coherence. When the psyche is no longer divided, the mind stops fleeing into the future or hiding in the past. Presence becomes the default state. The individual experiences life with a clarity that feels almost unfamiliar. Ordinary moments become vivid. Connections become deeper. Work becomes expression rather than obligation. Existence becomes textured rather than numbed. Completion also changes the experience of solitude. Solitude no longer evokes fear or loneliness. It becomes nourishment, a space where the psyche breathes, a space where direction clarifies without effort, a space where the self encounters itself with neither judgment nor avoidance. This solitude is not escape, it is communion. The eighth truth is that completion prepares the psyche for service, not service in the moralistic sense, but in the existential sense, the natural overflow of a stable self. When an individual is no longer consumed by internal conflict, they have energy to contribute beyond themselves. Their presence becomes stabilizing. Their words carry depth. Their actions influence without force. They become a reference point for others, not because they seek to lead, but because they embody coherence in a world starving for it. This service is not sacrifice, it is expression. It is what happens when inner alignment spills outward. Others feel it as trust, as steadiness, as clarity, as authenticity. Completion radiates. But the final truth of completion is the one most people misunderstand. Completion is not a finish line. It is a state of readiness. It is the moment when the psyche becomes capable of stepping into a new kind of life, a life that demands not only purpose, meaning, transcendence, and identity, but the full expression of everything the self has integrated. Completion is the threshold, not the destination. And once this threshold is crossed, the individual begins to sense the next inevitable movement, the shift from inner mastery to outer embodiment, the transformation of internal coherence into the creation of a life that reflects it. The self is ready now, not merely to understand existence, but to shape it. Meaning does not wait for us at the end of the world. It waits in the center of the self. After walking through acceptance, energy, strategy, foundation, adaptability, pressure, learning, inner freedom, emotional sovereignty, and the discipline of simplicity, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Philosophy is not an abstract system. It is a mirror. It reveals who we are when every excuse falls away. It strips the psyche of the illusions that kept us obedient to fear. It returns us to the quiet core where choice becomes destiny. The modern world overwhelms us with noise, speed, and endless demands to be everything except ourselves. We mistake movement for direction. We mistake stimulation for purpose. We mistake complexity for depth. But every chapter of this journey points toward the same confrontation. Life becomes unbearable when we refuse to meet ourselves honestly. The moment we turn inward with clarity, the architecture of suffering begins to shift. We stop resisting what cannot be changed. We stop surrendering to impulses that delude us. We stop drifting through days without anchoring them in intention. A human being cannot control the chaos of circumstance, but a human being can control the posture with which they stand inside that chaos. That posture is built through acceptance, strengthened by discipline, clarified by strategy, deepened by introspection, sharpened by adaptability, stabilized by emotional mastery, enlightened by simplicity. The result is not perfection, it is presence. It is the ability to move through life with a mind that is awake rather than reactive,